Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Multispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour. To be a part of the program, it is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. It's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this evening. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Ovens. Welcome in, sir.
Good evening, Noah. How's it going this week?
Hey, I had a pretty good week out at Linux Fest Northwest. It was a good time.
I had a day where the type of day that nobody wants to have if you're in technology. I had the power go out on a bunch of servers in my lab that they're not on backup because they're supposed to be throwaway. But of course, I was in the middle of doing work, and that just shattered everything. It broke all of the things, and then it took me a couple hours to get it back up. And what I didn't realize was the power outage actually shorted out the fans in the server case. And so then an hour or two later, all of the servers started shutting down, and I couldn't figure out why, and had to go down, and I saw that the cable was dangling from the fans. And so I ended up not once, but twice having everything ruined due to like unexpected shutdowns. And this one wouldn't have been avoided by a UPS.
Well, I can't do anything about your unexpected shutdowns for the UPS, but I can do something about unexpected shutdowns for the internet. We're talking about net neutrality tonight, and specifically common carrier background, because there is a tie. So broadly speaking, common carrier refers to the provider must treat the traffic equally. So this comes back from the 1934 Communications Act, Title II. Phone providers had to treat all traffic equally, meaning if you said something that the phone company didn't like, maybe you were bad-mouthing them, they still had to carry your phone call. That has its roots, or that is what net neutrality has its roots in, which is what we're going to be talking tonight. Net neutrality being ISPs must treat all traffic equally. So stemming from that 1934 Communications Act, Title II, it got a little more complicated in 1980 with the Computer 2 policy. The ideas were that the ISP was a common carrier, but enhanced services were not. So, for example, you might remember things like AOL dial-up. They were able to dial up to the AOL service. The phone line was common carrier, but the enhanced services was not. So they were able to get away with a little bit more. Then in 2002, when cable broadband came out, they got an exception because it was their own infrastructure. And that, of course, ticked off DSL and other ISPs. So in 2005, ISPs across the board were declared not a common carrier. Now that's important because between 2005 and 2015, the ISPs buried a lot of their own fiber. They paid for a lot of their own infrastructure. They made an investment under the understanding that they were not common carriers. So it came as a surprise to them in 2015 that ISPs were reclassified as common carriers, and it was largely seen as kind of this government takeover of the internet. In 2017, Ajit Pai was sat for the FCC position, and as a part of that, he repealed net neutrality. So joining us to help us understand these issues, it is Senator Kramer. He tweets at Sen Kevin Cramer. Senator Kramer, welcome to the Ask Noah show.
Setup there. Just listening to your setup there makes me nervous already. But that was a great history lesson. I appreciate that a lot. Good to be with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you making the time, sir. So the Federal Communication Act voted on Thursday to move forward with a proposal to restore open internet rules, that they call it, which were repealed during the Trump administration, with the final vote likely to come next year. And the FCC will be taking public comments on the proposed rule. The chair can then choose to incorporate comments into the final draft, and we'll probably see that early 2024 at the earliest. So my first question to you, sir, we've seen the FCC give tax subsidies to things like the Universal Service Fund, which assists with low-income customers, helping them pay for monthly telephone services and rural healthcare support mechanisms that allow them to get providers to pay for rates and school and library supports. if the infrastructure is subsidized by tax dollars, should that infrastructure be common carrier?
So that is a great question and a great catch, because universal service funds, for people that may not know what those are, that's a fund, that's a tax that everybody that uses a telephone pays, and then it's then distributed to underserved areas, really high expense areas, right? So North Dakota telecos, particularly rural telephone companies, receive universal service funds to build out part of their network. And frankly, one of the interesting things about the internet and its relation, broadband in particular, and its relation to rural telephone cooperatives in North Dakota is, I always say, our rural telephone cooperatives were broadband before broadband was cool. They were using universal service funds to build out, for example, fiber to the home, long before pretty much any other state was doing it, because they just were making those forward-leaning investments. And so it does raise your question: if this is publicly supported, should they be more highly regulated? To which I'd say no, they should not. We have lots of areas where certain things are subsidized, but they don't. Those subsidies don't come with the implied regulation of the heavy hand of the federal government, because the internet is still a largely very competitive, even in North Dakota, competitive industry, particularly with the advancement of technologies like wireless Wi-Fi. To your point, in fact, that kind of kicked this whole thing off. When the cable companies came in and put fiber to the home, or even cable itself, and it became a competitor to the Ma Bell, monopoly telephone company, it just changed the whole landscape. So I don't think the use of universal service funds, which are used around the country in a broad way, are a trigger, if you will, for further regulation.
So it's interesting. It's nice to talk with you, Senator Cramer. It's the first time that I've spoken with you, but I've listened to you on Noah's show in the morning from time to time. I was wondering whether or not it would make sense for some of these things to move under the FCC then, instead of the FCC, if we're not going the route of the common carrier.
Yeah, so some of them were. It's an interesting question, because the history of this is that prior to the reclassification, some of these things like the competitive things were under the FTC. It's when as I think about Noah's little monologue there, when it became part of the telecommunications service, that it fell under FCC. So, because some of the precepts that we're talking about, some of the conditions or the actual specific things that would be regulated under net neutrality are pretty commonly accepted. Things like no discrimination, no blocking, no throttling of certain content, things like that. Those are principles that conservatives as well as liberals, I think, largely agree with. If you're a free market conservative, you should agree with those kinds of things. But it's not. What it's not is a regulated monopoly utility. That in fact, I think the internet's the best example of how competition actually works, and how innovation and technology and the advancement of it is best unleashed in a free market competitive system. And while there might be some federal, or for that matter, if there might be tribal or other types of incentives, those incentives aren't specific to the technology so much as provided to sort of equal the playing field for underserved and unserved areas, particularly when you have things like healthcare and education, sort of resources and sources of services that we value in our communities across the country.
855 450 Noah, you're on Ask Noah. Good evening. That's you, Sleuth.
Sorry.
There you are.
What would you say to people that only have one good choice for internet? For example, the city that I live in used to have an agreement with Spectrum where they were the only cable provider for internet in this city. And their prices were not very competitive with other cities, and neither was their service. That agreement has since expired, and now we have many options, one of which is a fiber option. and they've all come down in price, and they've all gotten a lot more reliable and better service.
Yeah, it's a great question, because the concept of a regulated utility, a regulated monopoly utility, really goes even further back than the Telecom Act. It goes back to the Railroad Act back in the 1800s. And your example is exactly, I think, why we don't need net neutrality, because even in North Dakota, and granted, I give a lot of earned credit to our rural telephone cooperatives who were very forward-leaning and could see this well out in front. But North Dakota is the center of the North American continent. We have some advantages, with wireless, and that we don't have a lot of trees and mountains in the way. So wherever there's line of sight, there's a lot of technologies that work well. But now you have, of course, even space. You have Starlink, for example, that provides an umbrella in certain unserved areas. There's a lot of competition that has picked up that slack. And what I worry about is if you adopt net neutrality in its most fundamental form. And when I say that, it may start out as just non-discrimination, no blocking, no throttling, but Title II of the Act gives the FCC rate-making authority. They can determine a rate of return, for example, much like you used to with Ma Bell with AT&T. And so this is what I mean by, even in North Dakota, there are places that are fairly remote that have 3 or 4 options. I almost feel guilty sometimes when I talk to some of my friends from other places in the country when they talk about how unserved or underserved they are. When I say, "My goodness, do we have it nice in North Dakota?" But I think your example is kind of my point. You give it a little time, competitors will find their way, even in the most rural places.
So where I live, we have a lot of mountains. So if you live outside of a city, your options are DSL, which is terrible around here. Cable, if you're lucky, which will be one provider.
Mm-hmm.
Starlink, maybe, and Starlink is iffy a lot of places. So really, if you don't have access to some sort of a cable provider, and most of that's Comcast around here, which isn't very good, then you're kind of out of luck. I have a lot of friends that still are stuck on dial-up or Comcast, and it's old Comcast lines that aren't very good.
Sure. So no, great points, and it's not irrelevant, obviously. And this is where a big argument comes in, Noah. Sometimes you've already heard me refer to unserved and underserved. The definition of underserved is always changing because the definition of broadband is always changing.
Yes.
25 is not enough anymore, right? So there's no question there is a small percentage of outliers, and this caller probably lives in one of those. And I do think there can be exceptions made for that, and I don't mean net neutrality exceptions, but you might have noticed in the infrastructure bill that we passed, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that gets so much attention, and I was very involved in the architecture of that, and one of the areas that we put a lot of money into was unserved and underserved broadband to try to build out options and alternatives in places like this caller is describing exactly. So it would actually be sort of interesting. Now, I would say this, when we were doing all of that, by the way, the definitions of the various utilities or the providers that could access some of those funds, Elon Musk called up some of the senators and said, I could settle this for a lot less money with Starlink. I don't know whether that's true or not, but the problem with even a Starlink is they can cherry pick a little bit themselves. The difference being that there's no point in them going someplace that's already very well served. So I don't know how net neutrality could keep the price of that down, because obviously the cost of putting up a network of satellites, low Earth orbiting satellites, could be quite a bit. But there are technological solutions that maybe aren't quite commercial enough yet to be competitive. But that's why we passed that bill with the kind of dollars we passed specifically for broadband.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Steve, did you have a follow-up?
So it was related to something that you said earlier when you were talking about Ma Bell and stuff like that. One of the books that I really like is called The Master Switch, and it kind of goes over a bunch of the history of telecommunications, going all the way back from the telegram forward, and that triggered a thought. So I moved down from Canada, and in Canada we still have Bell up there, and they were able to get a sweetheart deal from the government such that once they've laid an infrastructure in an area, no other competition is allowed to lay new infrastructure, because they're trying to get the infrastructure to kind of roll out instead of just constantly serving the largest areas, right? And this has led to kind of what the caller was talking about, where you'd get Bell come into an area and they lay the lines, whatever it is, and now you're stuck because that's it. Unless, so the government did come in and say, well, you have to sell part of, like, you have to give some spectrum of the service to competitors like resellers and such like that. But as you can imagine, that's not really a good solution anyways. You're still all on the same infrastructure. So I wondered, is there a concern of that sort of thing happening here on one side or the other, whether you go with common carrier or not?
Yeah, so great question and great example, because that is exactly what happened with the breakup of Ma Bell, right? That the interconnection agreements were suddenly the rage. When I was, you might have seen the letter or the op-ed that we sent you, Noah. I think my office sent you anyway. That I wrote in 2009 on this very topic when I was a public service commissioner in North Dakota, because while the breakup of AT&T created lots of competitors, there's still some regulatory oversight of, even if you want to be a rate of return company, a telephone company in North Dakota, you can be. I think there's only one or two that have actually chosen that. The vast majority are competitive LECs, or as they're called, and they ride on the infrastructure of the incumbent LEC. So you have sort of a hybrid. The reason I think that's not relevant in the internet case is because there are so many other technologies. And frankly, I would submit to you, it's not even relevant in telecom anymore. I mean, if the cell phone world hasn't proven that you don't need all that other stuff. Now, as long as there's a phone in the house or in the office, a hard line, there is a last mile or a last 10 yards or whatever the case might be that hooks up to some hard infrastructure. But even all of that has changed dramatically with digital telecommunications. So I do worry about your point. That could be an outcome actually of net neutrality. And I think that's part of what those that would promote net neutrality, I think that's part of what they long for. The problem is that horse is way out of the barn. And I would even submit to you at this point, by the way, we haven't even talked about the legality of net neutrality. I don't believe, and nor do a couple of Barack Obama's former commissioners believe, that net neutrality will survive a Supreme Court challenge anymore because of the major questions doctrine that was used in West Virginia versus the EPA, because they've never been given that authority under the Telecom Act. They've never been given that authority. And you don't get to take authority. Remember, in fact, when you go back a little further, you guys, I've never been so nerdy for a long time. So Noah, thank you for this opportunity. But if you go back to the previous one or two generations of this discussion, it was the Chevron doctrine that the Supreme Court used to allow some net neutrality. And Chevron is the doctrine that says, absent clarity, we defer to the regulatory agency. They're the experts. And as you might imagine, to a mean-spirited right-winger like me, that's obnoxious, because if the Congress doesn't give you the authority specifically in law or the founders in the Constitution, you don't have it. And that's the new doctrine. And so Chevron's been replaced with major questions doctrine, and I just don't believe, and I think most lawyers, most legal experts don't believe, that net neutrality would survive a challenge at this particular Supreme Court in this time.
Can you talk about the openness principles? You said back in 2009 they were working very well for consumers and service providers. What are those openness principles, and what do you mean by they're working well?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because they are some of the specific stated principles of advocates of net neutrality, except they're also working. So things like prohibition on throttling. Throttling is choosing what to promote on your internet, what to push on your internet service provider, or on your cable, or on your whatever your ISP is, whoever you are. Same is true of blocking particular content. Legal content cannot be blocked by the network provider. and price discrimination. And this is one, guys, that, you talk about one that I love talking about. This is one that's sort of unsettling to me, to be honest. This is one where it's still evolving in my pea brain. And that is, gee, should Netflix be able to take up 80% of the pipe, during primetime hours for the same price? Netflix, that is, paying the same price for access as, say, the local library with its content, and that gets more to the content provider, not the end user, because the end users are obviously subscribing to some of these paid services. That's a legitimate discussion, I think. So I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but those would be the basic principles that are already governed either by law and rule, or frankly, more effectively by the marketplace itself.
So I read through your net neutrality statement and listening to some of your answers here, which, by the way, you're very articulate. I enjoy this conversation very much.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. I was wondering, so you kind of talked about concern about an ISP blocking a customer's access to the internet. Do you have any examples or any patterns of this happening? Like, are there cases where complaints are resolved when this happens?
Yep. So I can't think of one off the top of my head, but when I was a commissioner, a dozen years ago, in North Dakota, there were occasional complaints that would come up about a particular content, and some of it, by the way, guys, some of that's even been fixed just by the sheer magnitude and speed of the newer technologies and the internet, and even the same spectrum being able to squeeze more because of digitization and all these things that have made things better and faster and bigger. But we would have some, but they were always quickly resolved. And I wish I could think of one right now. It's been too long, but yeah, we'd get a call from somebody, or maybe even a particular area, a smaller community or something, where their streaming service wasn't working very well from 7 to 9, and of course most of that was a function of, again, just a whole bunch of users on at the same time. But when we would share that, usually just share it with the company. We didn't have any regulatory authority over it, but we were pretty good ombudsmen. Same with cell companies. We didn't discipline them, but we did facilitate a lot of this sort of public service, and almost always just resolved quite quickly and pretty painlessly. And in some cases, it was actually us facilitating a market. In other words, and that still happens, by the way, in even in Congress for certain things, where if you know your congressman or your senator, if you call them and they make an inquiry, sometimes things happen that might not otherwise happen. What might have happened if you just called the provider or the content provider. And so we had a lot of those. I just can't think of a specific one right now, but we definitely took a lot of them.
So if I may, I'll give you an example from Canada. Sure. And again,
sure.
I love to whip on Bell. I have very much a hate relationship with that company. So it was a couple of years ago now when World of Warcraft was at its kind of peak. What was happening was, if you were on Bell, you were beyond disadvantaged, because they were using, they being World of Warcraft, the updater was using a technology that Bell decided was just clogging up their network. So it wasn't just standard HTTP traffic to pull down the updates. And so they just summarily blocked it, and they never told anybody. And it took one of our newspaper exposés to bring it to light. And even then they just kind of shrugged and were like, it gums up the work for everybody else. And that was a pretty big problem, because Bell laid a lot of the infrastructure in Canada.
Yeah, for sure. And this is exactly the problem with net neutrality. If you confine an area to a single provider, and that provider then subjects themselves to rate regulation and a cost of doing business sort of analysis with a rate of return guarantee, you're simply not going to get the same type of service as if you have your telephone company competing with your cable company in the same markets. Now, again, that can't happen everywhere. But I'll tell you what, with the advancement of what's called, nowadays you have nomadic broadband. So you might have if you're on a farm, for example, you'll have internet or fiber to the farm shed, but then from there you have a transmitter, that goes to the tractor or whatever the case might be. There's lots of ways now to create opportunities, but net neutrality blocks those opportunities and really stifles the innovation that and this is true not just in Canada, this is true throughout Europe. Europe has this sort of same type of a net neutrality regime, and the consequence is that there's just not a lot of private investment taking place in those areas.
1-855-450-NO. It's 855-450-6624. The email, live at AskNoahShow.com. You're on Ask Noah. Good afternoon.
Hi, Senator.
Hi
so
there.
I have a question. Since your previous role was facilitating communications between the customers and the internet companies, what would there in my particular area, and I'm in a very highly populated sort of metro area right outside of a city.
Sure.
There's a very common practice that in a apartment complex will sign a service deal with a particular provider and not allow any other internet provider into the complex, and then in their bylaws prevent you from putting up Starlink or a sat dish or etc. What would your answer be to a situation like that?
Well, that sounds like a really bad business model for an apartment. For quite honestly, I don't understand, unless of course they have some sort of sweetheart deal with that provider. I suppose that's possible, and I would struggle with that. That seems like an FTC issue off the top of my head. So I've never heard of that happening, at least not in North Dakota. But that doesn't mean it doesn't. I've just never heard of that. That would be very objectionable to me. That would be a violation of, in my view, my opportunities. But unless, of course, I can move. I always have that right, but I don't know how easy that is where you live. It's interesting what you've just described, though, as a location, a community just outside of a larger city. One of the conflicts I remember we had to referee a few times early on, and I don't know how prevalent this is anymore in North Dakota, but because of the growing out of, of a city into the country, or the country going into the city, you might have a telecom, one of these rural telephone cooperatives, like I mentioned earlier, who does get universal service funds to provide this service, competing with the cable company that's in the same footprint. And that sometimes has been a sort of an unfair advantage, if you will, and you'll get the cable company crying foul. You'll get, but at the same time, they tend to cherry pick as well. So it seems to all work out in the wash. But your example I've never heard of, and my only initial response would be it sounds offensive to me, but I guess I'd try to move.
Internet access is becoming critical to modern life. It's today it's as critical as, electricity or running water. How would you address the people who say, I have limited access to the internet? For example, I live in a low income area, or I live in a rural area. And with this constant migration to online services, even for government services, for example, sometimes a simple billing issue could disconnect a citizen from government services. And so we call that, largely refer to that as the digital divide. We saw that increased during the pandemic. How would you respond to those people?
Yep. So we did see that happen during the pandemic, when we were all forced to go to the doctor online, to take our classes online, particularly if they were streaming or video classes, and it takes up a lot more bandwidth. But at the same time, over the course of that pandemic, you saw a build out like never before. That innovators and entrepreneurs just found ways to get that service to people, and because there was money to be made in it. And again, this is part of why in some of the legislation that followed, we made it even more available. One of the pieces of legislation, when I think back to my House days, when I was in the House, I was on what's called the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I was on the Telecommunications Subcommittee. And a colleague of mine at the time, and now he's a colleague of mine in the Senate, Peter Welsh, who was the lone congressman from Vermont, Democrat, and I got together, and we introduced and passed, and it's now law, legislation that allows rural nursing homes, nursing facilities to use universal service funds to build out their localized internet for to be used for video conferencing and telemedicine as a matter of quality of life, as a matter of convenience, so that they could stay longer in a nursing home rather than have to go into a hospital, for example. It was a preventative medicine idea, hugely successful. So we the government can create some incentives through things like the Universal Service Fund and some of the education funds and even healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid funds for access like telemedicine and use of Universal Service Funds. So I would say no. What I wouldn't want is a knee-jerk reaction that just has a government build out, if you will, to those areas, but maybe knock down some barriers and provide some appropriate incentives that make the market work rather than dictate the terms of the market.
So I want to circle back a little bit to some of the ideas that you kind of circled around them yourself a few times. So a lot of people would say, including myself, that broadband providers are private businesses. And I have a hard time coming to an understanding when I put on my business hat and say, okay, should someone be able to reach in and dictate policies in my business or not? And I'm not exactly sure how I fall down on this. So I'm curious, do they get to run their business as they choose? They slow down stuff or speed up or, provide accelerated access to specific things like Netflix or whatever.
Customers. Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't like it, change providers. Like, where do you fall on that?
No, I think blocking should be illegal. I think throttling should be illegal. I don't think that they should be able to, push out, say, a higher paying service, but I do think some of these services should pay more for more capacity on the internet. I should say I think that's worth exploring. I've always been more practical than ideological. I have some pretty strong principles, but we come from a populous part of the country for a reason. North Dakota has a state-owned bank, to fight back the big banks in Minneapolis, and the state-owned mill to fight back against the big millers in the Twin Cities back in the day. And so we have this strain that runs through this populism strain that was here way before Donald Trump. And so I have that in me as well. But I would say there are some principles such as blocking and throttling that should be illegal, just as a matter of, while not a monopoly, it is also quasi-utility. It's not utility, but it's quasi-utility, and it does enjoy some government protections, and it does ride on some government right-of-way and things like that I think, and not to mention just commerce itself, does have some rules around it. And those would be principles I would advocate in law. What I don't advocate for is some sort of a rate regulation or an overall Title II, as it's called. That's the distinction between Title I and Title II, is full rate regulation, which is what the net neutrality rule provides.
So like both of you, I largely come down into, I'm not into telling other businesses what to do, and we advocate on the show all the time, own your own infrastructure, in part because we don't own the ISPs, they own themselves. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, what prevents independent content creators like myself and this very show from being put in the so-called slow lane? What's to stop large companies from prioritizing the internet in their favor?
I think that is a law that if it's not law today can be passed. I don't think they should be able to do that. And if you experience that, I think you have every right in the world to call your regulator, call your congressman, call whoever at either the state or the federal level, and launch that complaint and look into it. I just don't think they should be able to do that. So that would be my remedy, rather than again a full-fledged regulatory regime that would get deeper into your business than you'd want them to get into it. And that's what stifles innovation. I always use the term light touch regulation. I think regulation is appropriate in many cases. I mean, the government is already very involved in lots of things, including taxation, including infrastructure and commerce, and protecting against monopolies and whatnot. So, but I think a light touch is much better than the heavy hand, and I think net neutrality is the heavy hand, whereas a few of these principles like blocking and throttling and prohibiting them are the light touch.
JJ4884 in the chat room asks, aren't ISPs notorious for promising expanded broadband in the past, but then they deem arbitrary numbers as enough for consumers? Yet countries like Sweden and South Korea are thriving with broadband and broadband speeds.
I'm not sure I understand that entirely.
So essentially what he's saying is, I think if I'm understanding what he's saying, he's saying, sure, are the ISPs promising expanding broadband, but then they deem that what they've done is enough?
Oh, sure. So that's a risk, particularly in places that don't have a lot of competition. But we have so much competition for that same customer that can only work so long. That's one of those principles I really do believe in strongly. One of the areas, just as an example, you've all seen the TV ad probably with Ted Danson and the two maps of a cell phone company coverage maps, and they're both exactly the same coverage. One's just a different color, and one costs less than the other one. That's an example of an application in telecom. One of the biggest areas of I'll use the most harsh term, but it might be too harsh, but I'll use it anyway. Is in terms of fraudulently advertising or marketing something you either do or you're going to do in terms of service, the speed of the internet, the coverage and whatnot. That's illegal. That should not be allowed. And if consumers see too much of that or see any of that, they should call the appropriate regulators or authorities and cry foul. And but those things again tend to be pretty well disciplined by the market itself, the consumer themselves. The consumer is always the best regulator, but sometimes you don't have enough consumers to apply that pressure and regulate. Again, thus the light touch. But no, what you've described is not. I don't know that it's common, but it certainly can happen.
When ISPs were classified as common carriers, there were more of them around, and as they've been declassified, obviously as they have to put in their own infrastructure to exist, that number has gone down. What impact, if any, do you believe net neutrality would have on ISP competition?
I just think it would. I think it would stifle investment myself. I really do. I just think what happens is. And by the way, I think prices would go up ultimately as well. Now, there are some people that will argue that, obviously, and they're not dumb people. But I just think it's more likely that with the lack of competition, with a guaranteed return on your equity, which is what rate regulation guarantees you, it provides you protection from competition, but it also diminishes your potential margins. I just think the outcome would be exactly counter to what we would want in a market that's pretty dang robust already. I would like to see entities like Starlink, and I think as prices go down, as the launching of more low Earth orbiting satellites, as those prices go down and the operation of them, they're practically a commodity now. I actually think there's more newer innovation that could become even more ubiquitous than what we already see.
So with the newer innovation, do you think it's time to either take an axe to the Communication Act, or maybe at least breathe a little new life into it?
You are you trying to get me in trouble? So actually, I've thought it's time to take on the Telecommunications Act for a long time, and that even applies to the telephone industry, the telecommunications industry. with everybody, with people, more and more people cutting the cord. I mean, I just did recently. I haven't had a phone, a hardline phone in my house for a couple of years, but I've been paying, the cable company for that service for a couple of years. I always prefer to do Noah's radio show on a hard line, but nowadays cell coverage, the cell phones are almost as good or better, and in some cases the microphones literally are better. So. Yeah, I do think it's time to take a hard look at the Telecommunications Act, but I also know that that would be a very heavy lift, and there better be some smart people ready to conduct those hearings, because that would be a battle royale. But I'm all for it. I think it's time to do exactly that.
Tiny in the chat room says, should the federal government or state government step in to break up local monopolies that aren't serving their customers well?
Well, I don't. If we're speaking specifically of ISPs, I can't see that. If we're talking about something else, there are, for example, other areas where there are monopolies that are protected by the government, and rural hospitals are one of them. We have in North Dakota 36 what are called critical access hospitals. They're guaranteed protection from competition. Well, actually, what they're guaranteed is a very small rate of return or margin on their covered expenses or their covered services, but they also don't have another hospital within 50 miles. So I don't know that you could, quote, break them up so much as maybe try to incentivize competition or subsidize the rate. But I don't know if the texter is referring specifically to the internet or not.
Senator Kevin Cramer, we appreciate the time as always. Would love to get you back on the program soon.
You've exhausted all my knowledge, so I don't know. We'd have to come up with a better topic. But you know who I was thinking about you guys, and Noah, you would like him a lot. I think you guys would. Well, you'd love him, and that's Ajit Pai. You referenced him earlier. You remember he was the chair of the FCC under Trump, so he's the guy that overturned the 2015 net neutrality rule, and then now it's his that's being overturned by the current FCC. Ajit's a Kansas guy, just a really great. He's been to North Dakota many times. He did a couple of events with me. He'd be a good guest on your show. So if you want to make the contact, I'd be happy to reach out to him sometime. I would love that, Senator. And again, I deeply appreciate the time you shared with us this evening. My pleasure. Thanks, guys. All right, sir. Have a good one. 855-450-NOAH. It's 855-450-6624. The email live at asknoahshow.com. Steve, should we do some email?
Let's do it.
All right. Our first email comes in tonight from John. John writes in and says, hi, guys. Do either of you have experience in expanding a pfSense VLAN from a /24 to a /23 or greater? Initially, I set up VLAN 20 to be 192.168.10.0/24. As I'm starting to run out of space, I want the interface to be changed over to the gateway IP from a /24 to a /23. Side note, I expected the pfSense to expand into the 192.168.11 subnet, but instead it went into the 192.168.9. I wonder why that is. Then I added the DHCP range and started the service. The new host came up with 192.168.9 subnet, and you could get to the internet. However, I was noticing at the firewall logs that the communication is being blocked between 10. and 9. After some searching, I found that the bypass firewall rules for the traffic on the same interface under System Advanced Firewalls NAT. The description reads, this option only applies if one or more static routes have been defined. This is enabled. Traffic that enters and leaves through the same interface will not be checked by the firewall. This is desirable in some situations where multiple subnets are connected to the same internet interface. This seems like it would be the right option. However, I still am finding traffic is being blocked. I've also tried creating explicit rules between the .9 and .10 subnets, allowing all the traffic, all of the protocols in all of the directions, but I'm still receiving the blocked by default, deny any rule. What gives? How can I expand a VLAN? And how come this problem? And is this a problem with VLANs, or is this something related to pfSense? Thanks. So, Steve, what say you?
So I went digging and I found several people that had similar things, not trying to expand a VLAN, but just simply like this error has been confounding people. Or I shouldn't say error. I should say this note in the firewall log. What I found was probably what this listener found, which was the top 10 results for things like this. If you dig is, hey, go turn on this setting because it's likely that you have a single NIC that is hosting multiple IP ranges, which that's exactly what would be happening here. So turn this thing on because it should tell the firewall, just let everything through if it's coming through and then back on the same interface. There were some manual steps. If the PFSense documentation called this the automatic fix, and there were some manual steps, although it sounds very without a better description of exactly what the rules were, and I'm not a PFSense expert, it sounds like the listener tried that as well. So I drew a blank. I also was puzzled by, and I confirmed on my own, that it went down a subnet instead of up a subnet, and I don't know why that is either.
So the answer to that really is, and you'd almost have to write this out, but essentially when we're talking about subnets, when we say 255, 255, 255, those sorts of things, right? Really what we're talking about is masking bits out. And so if we write out 8 ones, that would be all of the bits are masked. That's how we get 255. And so if we understand binary, we look up a binary chart, we're starting with 1, then we go to 2, then 4, then 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. All the bits added up together, that's how we get our 255. So depending on when the ones start and the zeros start, that's where the subnet is going to break. And so you can use, it's important to wrap your head around why things work this way. And so I would encourage you to look up some subnetting videos, and that will give you more of an understanding, as it's kind of hard to explain in audio only. But the short version is, if you start adding up the bits and you look at where that break is, it's if you divide it into a /23, half of that subnet is going to be on 9, the other half is going to be on 10. But I think it's important to note here, we're not really creating two subnets. If you've changed it from a /24 to a /23, you have a larger subnet. You don't have two subnets, you have a larger subnet. And thus, you shouldn't need any firewall rules to route between what is one gigantic subnet. My guess, if I were a betting person, is if you go and look in the interface where you've defined your network inside of PFSense, my guess is somewhere in there you still have a /24. The other thing to consider is all of the devices after they get their /23 must be rebooted, or at least have their network interfaces cycled. If you don't do that, you'll be able to talk to some things on the network, but not other things, because some devices will have a /24 and others will have that /23, but the ones that have the /24 aren't aware of the /23.
You know what? I wonder if that isn't it. Again, not enough detail, but I would imagine if I was testing this out, I probably wouldn't think, hey, I've got 200 devices or however many I have that I need to expand. I need to reboot them all.
Right.
Like, I don't know that I would think that.
Yep. Yeah. And that's one of the most common things I see is when we expand a subnet is in getting all the devices to refresh. And then sometimes you get static tables and stuff but just powering it off, powering it back on almost always fixes it. So give that a shot. And if not, right back in. We'd love to help. Our second email comes in from Rit. Rit writes in and says, is this outlandish? Running all traffic through a PFSense VM hosted on Fedora 38 running Virtual Machine Manager or Proxmox? Haven't quite decided. So essentially, it would go to the internet, to the ISP's router, to bridge my NIC to my Fedora machine, then to a VM. So I think if I'm understanding right, Steve, he's talking about just virtualizing PFSense on a Fedora box. I'm not sure why that would be a bad idea at all.
I did this for a super long time, like 2 or 3 years, because I was not comfortable admitting PFSense, but I was comfortable admitting Ubuntu. And so I had an Ubuntu with a PFSense VM and I had no issues, because if you're passing the NIC into the VM, then the host doesn't even see it anyways. So it's not like there's any kind of chance of leaking out to the ISP that you're running Ubuntu, or in this case, Fedora.
Yeah, we played with it for a little bit in production at a few clients, and ultimately we'd jettisoned the idea, not because it didn't work. It worked fantastically well. In fact, it made a lot of things really easy, but we noticed that one of the potential issues is, obviously, if you have a bad day with your vhost, now you've lost your access to the internet to research how you can go about fixing your vhost. And so it's kind of that thing of having all your eggs in one basket. So just for redundancy's sake, I like the idea of having the router on its own separate thing. And then oftentimes if I'm caring about redundancy or I want to virtualize, sometimes I'll have a physical router, and then maybe I'll have a virtualized router, but there's a physical one there that's also running pfSense, so you can just kind of slide back and forth between. Chris writes in and says, after listening to your thoughts on the U.S. emergency alert test, I was thinking about the premise of the U.S. government reaching into your phone, and I'm not sure I agree with that. To be fair, I do find testing annoying, but if you approach it from the other side, the cellular network, it makes a lot more sense. Your device is connecting to a government-regulated communication network, the cellular infrastructure. Under the U.S. WARN Act, Congress allowed participating wireless carriers to offer subscribers the capability to block all WAA except national alerts. So all devices provided by wireless carriers must be capable of receiving those alerts. Optionally, you can also disable most alerts, but must prohibit disabling national alerts. But then it goes back to the alerts broadcast over cellular networks. So you can avoid them simply or inconveniently by disconnecting from the cellular service and going Wi-Fi only. I have to be honest, Steve, that guy makes a lot of sense.
I mean, he's speaking your language by saying Wi-Fi only, right?
Well, it's just what his point is, like, if you're connecting to a third-party service, you're asking for the service from that infrastructure. There's a government body around that infrastructure that has said, here's the best way to serve people or how most people want to be served. So if you don't like it, you can just say, I'm not going to be on a cellular network, and then you won't get the alerts. But if you choose to pay for a service and subscribe to that service, part of that service is being pushed alerts when there's an emergency. Even if I don't agree with it, I mean, even if I don't like the idea of how it impacts me, I understand where that guy is coming from, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
And it's clear to me, and we won't get into this, but I think it's a timely message compared to the Senator Kramer is talking about. Like, there is no other option, though. Like, your option is have a cell phone or don't have a cell phone under this situation. So, I mean, I'll just leave it there, but I think that's an interesting point.
Well said. All right, we'll do the Newswire a little bit late today, but here's JT.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of October 22nd, 2023, here's the Linux and open source news. Samba 4.19.2 is out. The lightweight text editor Genie has released version 2.0. pzip 9.5 is out. The open source DAW Ardor has released version 8 and an 8.1 hotfix. VirtualBox 7.0.12 is out. The Mozilla project has announced the release of Firefox 1.19. Moonlight, the open source PC client for NVIDIA GameStream and Sunshine, has released version 5.0. In kernel news, Linux for RISC-V is preparing real-time support, and the kernel team is planning on removing support for QLogic 10GB E cards from the kernel due to no one maintaining the code. In security news, Black Cat ransomware now uses a new Munchkin Linux VM for stealthy attacks. Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 has discovered that Black Cat's new Munchkin tool is a customized Alpine Linux distribution that comes as an ISO file. After compromising a device, the threat actors install VirtualBox and create a new virtual machine using the Munchkin ISO. Munchkin enables Black Cat to run on remote systems and encrypt SMB file shares. In open source AI news, NVIDIA boosts LLM inference with a new open source library they are calling TensorRT LLM. And researchers from several universities and Yulthor AI, the company renowned for its open source models, have introduced Lima, an open source large language model specifically designed to solve mathematical problems.
The music in our ears means we're out of time. I thank you for joining us. Hey, if you're one of the people I had a chance to see at Linux Fest Northwest, it was an absolutely great time hanging out with the JB crew and seeing all of the impacts that happen at Linux Fest Northwest. It may have not been the full fest, but nothing was spared from the relationship aspect of hanging out with old friends and making some new ones. We're back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. You can join us live, AskNoahShow.com. Head over to podcast.asknoahshow.com. Check out all of the articles and references we use to make the show. We'll see you back here next week.